The climate is changing our planet. As global warming begins to grip, scientists are peering into the future, trying to predict what our new world will be like. But we humans have been here before. We've already experienced catastrophic climate change. So in this series, I'm looking into the past to discover how climate shaped our destiny.
Oh, it is stunning, isn't it?
Joining me, a climate scientist, Joy Singaraya.
This has to be the most amazing landscape I've ever been in.
And archaeologist, Jago Cooper.
Looking at it from the air, as far as we can see here, this would all have been water.
We're travelling around the globe through 200,000 years of human history to find out what our ancestors did when violent climate change turned their world upside down. In this programme, we're going to find out how the end of the last great ice age launched civilization. In Europe, we'll see how global warming unleashed an agricultural revolution. And in North Africa, we'll discover how a savage drought led to the creation of the Kingdom of Egypt.
This is the beginning of Egyptian civilization, right here.
Join us on our quest to find out what happened in mankind's extraordinary 200,000-year battle with the climate. "12,000 years ago, our planet was emerging from the last great ice age. It had locked the Earth and all the humans living on it in an icy grip for 100,000 years. But now suddenly, the planet was warming. Temperatures rose by more than 5 degrees in just a few decades. Ice sheets were melting and sea levels rising, with disastrous consequences for many of our ancestors. Off the south coast of England, archaeologists are uncovering extraordinary evidence of a once thriving Stone Age settlement that's now 11 metres underwater.
Well, we found this piece of timber here that's next to that structure.
Is that edge worked, Gary?
I think it may be, but we'll know if we can bring it up.
If ever there was a demonstration of the power of the climate, this is it. Because 8,500 years ago, this settlement was just one of many dotted around the southern and eastern coasts of Britain. But global warming at the end of the Ice Age caused sea levels to rise, amputating Britain from Europe and drowning a civilization. The hunter-gatherers of coastal Britain weren't the only ones whose world was transformed by global warming. On the border between Asia and Europe, it turned the lives of another group of humans upside down. To begin with, global warming was good for the early settlers living on the plains of what's now Turkey. It allowed them to establish a revolutionary new way of doing things that would alter forever the way we humans live. Climate scientist Joyce Ingaraya has come to Turkey to discover more about them. She's on her way to Çatalhöyük, one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. "9,000 years ago, it was probably the biggest single human settlement on the planet. In charge of Çatalhöyük's excavation is project director Ian Hodder.
So here we're coming into Çatalhöyük.
Wow. There's so many different things going on here. It's quite hard to take it all in at once.
The whole site is just house on top of house on top of house.
So roughly how many people lived here then?
So we think that it's about 8,000 people here at maximum.
Wow. So this is just a very small part of the whole thing.
That's right, yeah.
Çatalhöyük was unearthed in the late 1950s.
So this is a really...
Since then, the remains of more than 2,000 dwellings have been excavated.
Fantastic.
While most people could only aspire to live in wooden huts, these people lived in brick houses with rooms.
So to get from one room to the other, you'd have to crawl through here like this.
That's
You get really,
not
really...
very easy at all.
In one of them, amazingly well preserved, is a clue to the new way of life they were living.
And you can see very nicely just the remnants of the storage bins that they had in this small room. They would have stood up much higher. We found the scar on the wall, so they're like this.
What would they put in these then?
They were full of a great range of different types of seeds, mainly wild seeds, in fact, but they also had quite a range of cereals.
OK. And does that suggest anything about the way they were living then?
Yes, so these were agriculturalists. And Çatalhöyük is the first major site that was discovered outside the Near East, where you have a large settled town, really, that was dependent on agriculture.
The inhabitants of Çatalhöyük in Turkey were among the first pioneers of farming. A new way of living, made possible by the onset of a warmer, more stable climate 12,000 years ago. Farming began in a region of the Middle East known as the Fertile Crescent. It then spread further east and northwest into Turkey. For about 190,000 years, our ancestors had lived nomadic lives, wandering the landscape for food. The invention of farming meant this was no longer necessary. People had learned that in a favourable climate, it was much easier to grow your own.
What were they growing then?
Well, we find different types of wheat, and here we've got a charred wheat ear that has been impressed or preserved in a mud brick, and that's a beautiful impression of a...
So it's been burnt in the brick then?
It's been burnt, and that hence the preservation.
Wow, that's spectacular. And what kind of tools would they have been using then?
So here we have the collection of stone tools that they would have been using. This is a quernstone.
What's a quernstone?
Well, they would have used that as the base, and then something like this to start crushing the grain, the wheat, any food stuff like this.
So they're making flour then?
Well, we think they're making flour, yes. And then for crop cutting, they would be using tools made out of obsidian, which is a volcanic glass, and working it is technologically quite difficult to do. So it's something that they've achieved. You can see an example here, very, very fine chips and very sharp.
And this would have been attached to something long?
Yeah, yes, it would have been attached to a haft, and here we have some of the smaller flint tools that they would have attached to a haft, and it would have been used like a sickle blade. And if you look carefully, you can just about see the sheen on the edge, which is the sickle glass, which gives us an indication that they were actually cutting the crops with these tools.
It wasn't just in Çatalhöyük that they were doing this. Right across Turkey, and in particular in the fertile areas around what's now the Black Sea, archaeologists have found the remains of farming pioneers. Unlike their hunter-gatherer ancestors, global warming had allowed the first farmers to settle, build houses and villages, and develop new skills such as producing pottery.
This is an example of pottery from the earliest levels, and you can see that it's quite thick. And from this thickness in the middle of the sequence, we come to pottery that is very thin-rimmed. The clay becomes much stronger, lovely shiny gloss on it. They're getting better at everything.
But for some of the Turkish farmers, this comfortable new life was about to change. Because 8,500 years ago, the same global warming that had made farming possible was about to trigger a climate catastrophe that would change the face of the planet. At the end of the last ice age, global warming triggered a revolutionary new way of living: farming. It began in the fertile Crescent region of the Middle East 12,000 years ago. Within a few thousand years, it spread further east and northwest into Turkey. But shortly after it had taken root there, a climate catastrophe threatened to destroy both the Turkish farmers and their new way of life. The first clue as to what happened is to be found in one of the great capitals of the world. I'm in Istanbul. All this land here, that's Europe, and the land over there is Asia, and this water is the Bosphorus Strait, that's here. And as you can see, it links the Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. But 8,500 years ago, neither the Strait nor the Black Sea were here. And all this was dry land. Clearly, something extraordinary must have happened to flood this entire region. And it seems global warming was to blame. My search for answers leads me out onto the Black Sea. With me is geographer Chris Turney. What would the land have been like under this boat before the inundation?
Well, about 9,000 years ago, we'd actually have been on land. And out there would have been this large lake, a lot smaller than the Black Sea is today.
The lake was fed by rivers and streams. The area around it, lush and fertile. Much like Turkey's interior today, it was populated by farmers.
There were certainly farmers in the region, and we can make certain assumptions about what the density would have been. And if you make those sort of assumptions, we're looking at the order of around 140,000 people. And the early farmers would have been really attracted to these sort of areas as an area where they've got a reliable water source all year round to grow crops.
These farmers, though, were living on borrowed time. Because the area where they'd settled was below sea level. The only thing keeping the Mediterranean from washing over them was a narrow strip of land called the Bosphorus Sill. It acted like a dam, and for more than 2,000 years it kept the farmers safe from harm. But their luck was about to run out.
We think around 8,400 years ago, it looks like the Bosphorus sill was breached.
Was there a huge gush? Did it fill up in a year and a half, or did it take 300 years?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about that. Initially, it was thought to have happened really quickly, but the latest estimates suggest about 30, 34 years, something like that. It would be a phenomenal amount of water, probably something about 5 cubic kilometres a day. It would have taken about 3 decades to fill the Black Sea.
So what happened? How did global warming cause the Mediterranean to smash through the Bosphorus sill? The answer lies over 5,000 miles away in northern Canada, one of the most desolate landscapes on the planet. Archaeologist Jago Cooper has come here to investigate one of the most spectacular climate disasters in human history. The river system Jago's on is the first clue as to what happened. It's the remnant of a vast lake that dominated northern Canada. Just how big the lake was is clearer from the air.
This lake was just huge. It was the size of California.
Patrick Lajeunesse has been piecing the evidence here together to better understand the climate event that took place.
Looking at it from the air, as far as we can see here, this would all have been water. All this area, everything that you can see here was covered by the lake.
The lake was called Lake Agassiz, and it was created by global warming. It formed above sea level when ice sheets melted at the end of the last ice age. At its peak, it covered an area of over 840,000 square kilometres and contained over 163 trillion tonnes of water. It was held in place by a massive ice sheet that acted like a dam.
So we've been standing here, there'd been an enormous lake spread out in the distance, and this ice dam would have been preventing that water from going out.
Yeah, there was this big ice dam right there.
And how high would that have been? It would have been right
a few hundred meters.
Huge. And we'd have seen it stretching for miles all the way along.
Oh, hundreds of miles.
And there'd been ice coming off it?
You would have some big pieces of ice that were dropping down, then going in the lake to form icebergs. It's exactly what you see now in Antarctica or Greenland.
Yeah.
That is exactly what we had at the edge of the glacier there.
The ice dam is crucial. It was the only thing holding back 163 trillion tonnes of water from draining into the Atlantic Ocean. But as the planet continued to warm at the end of the last ice age, the ice dam was melting. And around 8,400 years ago, it finally gave way. To find out what happened to Lake Agassiz when it did, Patrick and his colleague Guillaume used sonar to map the contours on the other side of the ice dam under the Hudson Bay.
And so what do these images show us?
Well, the images here, they show us large dunes we call sand waves. And you can imagine sand waves like being desert dunes, similar to the ones we can see now in the Sahara Desert. And they can reach like 3, 4, and even 10 meters high, and tens and tens of meters of width.
What do they tell us about the nature of the drainage of the lake?
Well, since dunes are produced by currents, they show us that these sand waves were built by the high-energy currents under the ice sheet when actually the lake drained below the ice.
Patrick and Guillaume have built up a detailed picture of what happened when Lake Agassiz emptied. As the ice dam melted, it became weaker, especially at the bottom. Eventually, it was undermined and floated up. 163 trillion tons of water gushed underneath and poured into the Atlantic Ocean. The lake emptied at a rate of approximately 5 to 10 million tons per second. It was all over in less than a year, and its impact was catastrophic. The intensity of the drainage shot a pulse of water hurtling across the Atlantic. It raised global sea levels and helped amputate Britain from Europe. But the repercussions didn't end there. The pulse also pushed the Mediterranean over the Bosphorus sill and increased the size of the freshwater lake on the other side. Do you think there would have been a huge waterfall at the Bosphorus Seal?
Yes, it would have looked quite impressive, actually. Yes, it would have been phenomenal, the amount pouring over it. The people living around this area have seen it, and they've seen a huge amount of water pouring in.
The flood that enlarged the lake started as a small trickle. As the trickle widened and deepened, it turned into a torrent. Eventually, the entire sill eroded away. Within a single generation, the freshwater lake expanded over a populated area the size of Ireland. It created what we know today as the Black Sea. But what happened to the pioneering farmers who lived here? 8,400 years ago, global warming released 163 trillion tons of icy fresh water into the sea. It raised global sea levels by about a metre and flooded vast areas, including the land under what's now the Black Sea, inhabited by some of the world's first farmers. Global warming had brought their comfortable lifestyle to an abrupt end and forced them to leave. But where did they go? Climate scientist Joyce Singaraya has travelled 800 miles west of the Black Sea to meet someone who thinks he knows. Archaeologist Darko Komso is excavating the remains of a Stone Age community on the Istria Peninsula in Croatia. He believes the people who lived here were the descendants of the Black Sea farmers.
So tell me what we're looking at here then, Darko.
This is the occupational level. You could see the remains. We see all the pieces of flint, pieces of pottery they used, so you could tell it's archaeological site. And the largest pit, very complicated.
The site covers several hundred square metres, including these pits that contained clay and wood houses.
What kind of people were living here?
Well, that's the beauty of this site. We found very, very clear evidence that this was one of the first farming sites in Europe. People farmed here like 7,700 years ago.
That's not the only reason Darko's site's important. It was occupied only a short time after the Turkish farmers were flooded out. And the two communities seem to have quite a lot in common.
I recognise some of the items on here. Why don't you tell me a bit first about the flint that you've got?
Here we have blades with remains of cutting of the vegetation. If you look carefully at them, you see they shine, and it's called sickle gloss.
And the gloss comes from the fact that it's been used repeatedly?
Yeah, and it's actually one of the key evidence for farming.
Archaeologists have long been mystified about how farming began in Europe. But now it seems Darko has the answer. Because the evidence here suggests that it wasn't farming that had arrived in Europe, but the farmers themselves.
All data that we collect, that we have from the record, archaeological, suggests that they actually came with the whole completely Neolithic package. So they didn't invent here agriculture or something. They came with the knowledge.
Do you find the same thing in the pottery?
Yeah, we have 3 different types of pottery, suggesting 3 different periods.
I recognise this kind of pottery. I think I've seen something like this over in Turkey.
You're right. I mean, there is very similar pottery that could be found in the area close to the Black Sea.
Wow, that's amazing. So how do you explain the similarities?
Well, this is intriguing and very interesting question. There is one thing that suggests that there was a large change in environment and climate. So due to the rise of the sea level, we had the flood of the Black Sea plain, which pushed and forced people to move and migrate to the other regions. This is how we could explain, actually, the moving and similarities of the pottery in distant regions.
So 7,700 years ago, the first farmers arrived in Europe. Refugees from here, Turkey. Forced to move on when global warming created the Black Sea and flooded their homeland. In search of new fertile land, many migrated west and settled in places like Croatia. Climate change had triggered one of the most important developments in European history. After more than 25,000 years of endless wandering, never knowing quite where the next meal was coming from, our European ancestors could finally settle down. They could build permanent houses and villages to live in. They could plan their lives around the harvests. And they could use the surplus produce to trade with their neighbours or expand the local population. It's exactly how billions of people all over the planet still live today. Farming, though, isn't the only aspect of our lives today that has its origins in the Stone Age. So too is the fact that we live in nations, with rulers, capital cities and distinct cultures. But this wasn't always the case. We started living this way because of climate change. It began about 7,000 years ago when a drought struck North Africa and transformed the lush savanna that had been there since the end of the Ice Age into the barren Sahara Desert we know today. A catastrophe for the people living there at the time, but the beginning of a process that would lead to the foundation of one of the greatest civilizations in history. The Kingdom of Egypt. Egypt was founded and flourished on the banks of the River Nile. To discover more about its origins, archaeologist Jago Cooper has come to its first capital. It's called Hierakonpolis. When it was built nearly 6,000 years ago, it was unlike anything else on the planet. It was one of the world's first cities.
So here we are in this incredible mud brick building. Tell me what it's called.
Well, we call it the fort, but it's really officially the ceremonial enclosure of King Hasehemwe, which is a mouthful, which is why we call it the fort. It's the oldest freestanding mud brick structure in the world. It was built at about 2700 BC. It's estimated to take 4 million bricks just to build this one.
And what a statement it must have been.
It would have been an amazing landmark, and it still is today.
The fort stands at the centre of an extraordinary complex of structures, including the remains of a temple, workshops and houses. But it's not just the city's scale that's significant. So too is what went on inside it. These are the remains of a brewery, one of the earliest examples anywhere in the world of large-scale industry.
These are these giant vats where they boiled up the grain to make what's called the wort, and they took this liquid and they transferred it over there for fermentation.
So there are two separate activity areas.
And then a third activity area is here. This is where they were making the beer jars to put it all in.
Fantastic. So how are these vats? Any idea of the volume they might have held?
Well, we're estimating, 300, 400 gallons. Just look at the size of them. I mean, you can see that there were originally 6 of them. So you're making almost 1,000 gallons of beer in every process.
And it's not just beer. There's evidence here of the industrial production of pottery, building materials and tools.
We're seeing a very organized, sophisticated society where you have beer being made by specialists, you have specialist production of pottery, everyone has their place in society and everyone's working together to make sure that it works.
So Hierakonpolis really represents that start of the stratified society. It really starts out here and it's something which is built on over time.
Yes, I think this is the beginning of Egyptian civilization, right here.
Hierakonpolis wasn't just one of the world's first cities. It was also the capital of one of the world's first kingdoms. The Kingdom of Egypt. But who were the founders of this remarkable city? The answer to this question lies several hundred kilometers west of the Nile, and 7,000 years in the past, when a climate catastrophe changed the face of a continent. I must confess, this seems a pretty unlikely landscape to find the roots of one of the world's greatest civilizations. This is the Sahara Desert in North Africa, a great swathe of rock and sand that stretches from the Atlantic coast all the way across to the Indian Ocean. 3 million square miles of barren nothingness. Despite being one of the most hostile and impenetrable environments on Earth, the Sahara was once teeming with human life. Well, so I'm told, but I must admit, I find it pretty hard to believe. There's absolutely no sign of life here at all, and no sign that there ever has been life here. But Ahmed here, my Bedouin guide, has promised to show me something that'll change my mind. What are these things?
This is something like animals or...
Oh, I see, yeah. This is amazing here, isn't it? All these gouges out of the side of the cave. It's like a big body there, isn't there? There's the front leg. And then Is that a very long neck?
Yeah,
Like a giraffe, maybe?
I think. And I have something there.
Okay.
Look at the hand here.
Oh. Oh, yeah, because there's not just one, is there? There's one below it and this odd thing in the middle.
Yes, and all things in the middle, and we have another one here. You can see.
Oh, yes, I do, yeah, just round the corner. The rock art is about 7,000 years old. And the descendants of the people who made it went on to build the Kingdom of Egypt. Tomorrow, archaeologist Fakhri Hassan is going to show me how climate change transformed their world and launched their journey to civilization. About 7,000 years ago, this stark landscape in the Egyptian Sahara wasn't nearly so barren. It looked more like this lush green savanna. Like the great savannas of Africa today, it was pulsing with life. Plants, animals, and humans. But their world was turned upside down. Over 2,000 years, the monsoon rains that kept the savanna green and fertile moved south, and the region was transformed into the harsh desert we know today. Remarkably, the transformation led to the founding of one of the greatest civilizations in history, the Kingdom of Egypt. I've been joined by archaeologist Fakhri Hassan to find out how. This is the most incredible landscape. I don't think I've ever seen anywhere so completely devoid of life before.
It's true, it's amazing. Look around you. You can't even see a single blade of grass. But just imagine 10,000 years ago to 7,000 years ago, this was a quite lush environment. You know, there was water here, there were plants, trees, and people.
Fakhri's taking me to the remains of a settlement where a group of those humans lived. Oh, this is archaeology, isn't it?
That's right.
Those rocks there, are they some kind of structure?
Well, they're the foundations of a house.
Oh, it's quite little, isn't it?
It is little, but it can house about 3 to 5 people.
3 to 5?
And remember,
All
this
right,
is...
in,
yes, you can get in.
It's a bit of a squash, 3 to 5 people.
Well, it depends on how you sit. This would have been the foundation of the house, with some of the slabs are still standing. And then it would be like a wickiup with all kind of branches and then covered with maybe skin of animals and all kinds of different things to make it habitable.
Is this another one over here?
Yes, it is. There is one right there, and actually you can see a whole row of them.
This is one here?
Right.
And then another one?
Getting into one, yes, one behind it.
This one here?
Yes.
2 more behind it?
Yes, and more.
So if they're all in a line, what does that imply?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that why would be aligned like that, and that would suggest that there is some kind of a social structure. Another factor is the fact that this is the shore of a lake that once existed and covered this whole depression.
It is very hard to believe that at one time there was a lake here.
You can see these hillocks are the remnants of the lake bed that once existed here.
I see, so all the rest of the lake bed has eroded away and it's just left these stumps sticking out.
Absolutely, because this was a continuous surface. It was a continuous lake bottom.
Archaeologists have found evidence of lakes and lakeside settlements like this one all over the Sahara. That's because 7,000 years ago, there was lots of water here in North Africa, supplied by regular monsoon rains. Life flourished, humans and their prey.
And if you look closely, you will find all kinds of things. So here, ostrich eggshells.
Ostrich?
Yes. So in this environment, you had ostriches running around, and people were collecting the eggs and using these as water containers. And here is a little flake.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yes.
So that would have been used in the making of tools, yes?
Yes, this is a byproduct of making tools. And in fact, one of their main activities was hunting. So they were actually using these to prepare arrowheads.
What sort of animals would they have hunted?
Well, they had gazelle, and they had hares, and they had antelopes, but mostly gazelle. That was the most common animal that they were hunting.
And they had ostrich?
And they had ostriches.
For thousands of years, the people who lived here enjoyed what appear to have been pretty idyllic lives. But 7,000 years ago, a change in atmospheric pressure caused the monsoon rains to weaken and move south. In less than 2 millennia, tens of thousands of square kilometers of lush, fertile savanna were transformed into the parched Sahara Desert we know today. The lake here dried up even quicker. What would the effect of the people who lived around here have been?
Well, the effect would have been catastrophic because they've lost all their life resources. The water is gone, the plants are gone, the animals are gone.
How long do you think this whole change took?
Well, remarkably, it didn't take very long. It only took about 100 years.
100 years from a brimful lake all the way around here to this barren waste?
Absolutely. Within 3 or 4 generations, it was gone. It's an incredibly huge event, a global event of intense impact.
For the inhabitants of a settlement like this one, the gradual weakening of the rain and the encroachment of the desert meant they had no alternative but to leave, and leave behind a way of life that had been in their blood for thousands of years. It must have been a bewildering and devastating experience. But what would they do next? The answer takes me, as it took the Saharan refugees, several hundred miles west. Their only hope of survival was to find a source of water that the drought couldn't dry up. Something like this. The River Nile. And what a sight it must have been for those desperate Saharan refugees. But before they could begin their new life here, they faced a challenge. Just look at the landscape of the Nile. On either side, you've got a few tens of meters of green, fertile abundance, and beyond it, on either side, hundreds of miles of desert. No water, no vegetation, no life. There simply wasn't enough room here for a nomadic lifestyle. To survive, the Saharans had to find an entirely new way of life, and that's precisely what they did. Less than 1,000 years after severe drought forced the first refugees to abandon the barren Sahara Desert, they'd built Hierakonpolis, one of the world's first cities. 1,000 years after that, they'd become citizens of Egypt and were writing, trading, and building the pyramids. The Saharan nomads had come on a remarkable journey. They'd not only established one of the world's first cities, they'd established one of the world's first kingdoms. And by doing so, they'd created a model by which humans, not just around here, but all over the world, would begin to live. And still do today. In the 12,000 years since the end of the Ice Age, we've transformed ourselves from being a mere species to being civilized, sophisticated, political people, living in kingdoms, cities and villages all over the planet. It's a remarkable story, and we did it in the face of climate change. So is climate change always as catastrophic as we imagine? For the people who lived here 7,000 years ago, it must have seemed like the end of the world. But we now know it wasn't. It was the beginning of a new era. It forced them to adapt and shows us that human ingenuity can transcend a crisis, which may offer us, at the beginning of the 21st century, at least a crumb of comfort.